Alrighty, everybody. Welcome to the second half of the Unit 4. Here we're still looking at monetary policy. We're looking at how it's going to affect aggregate demand. One kind of nitpicky area that the College Board likes to test on is this difference between the money supply and monetary base. They mean similar things, but are slightly different. If we're looking at the monetary base, that's really what the Federal Reserve can control. We're looking at both what's available to banks, so bank reserves, and the money in circulation. So that's money being spent now. I'm not going to be able to spell circulation there, but you get the idea. The money supply is that money that's in circulation as well as checkable deposits. So the accounts that you have at a bank. So essentially what that means is when the Federal Reserve uses monetary policy, they're not directly changing the money supply, they're changing the monetary base. If they buy bonds back from banks, the banks have more money to then lend out, which then puts it back into the money supply. So it is kind of a nitpicky difference, but that monetary base is what's available to banks. The money supply is what's available to consumers. All right, again, let's hold off on conversations, please. Do open market operations initially change the money supply, the monetary base, or both? That's just kind of what I was getting at there, the monetary base. They're changing how much banks have to lend out, and then once they lend it out, it's in the money supply. Of the three traditional tools of monetary policy, the one most often used by central banks would be the open market operations. All right, and the reasoning behind that is because they can really easily change the interest rates on those bonds, and they're not really forcing banks to do anything, but if interest rates are high, banks are more likely to buy those bonds. If interest rates are low, they're less likely to buy the bonds and more likely to lend it out. So they use these open market operations to push a lot of money kind of quickly into the economy if needed. Now 28, we're just going to do a couple practice ones on because we've already done that in one of the earlier practices. Taking a look at this first one, let's remember the main formula, total change equals the initial change times the multiplier, and we use this reserve requirement to get our multiplier, 1 over the reserve requirement. All right, so it's saying here that the monetary policy is that the Fed buys bonds, the initial change is $10 billion, and that increases the money supply by $50 billion. So we know that the multiplier then must be 5 if the initial change is 10 and the total change is 50. So if we're looking at this multiplier being 5, 1 over the reserve requirement equals 5, divide both sides by 5, it would be, let me double check real quick to make sure I'm doing this math right, a reserve requirement of 0.2. 1 divided by 0.2 equals 5. Now the second one, the Fed's selling the bonds, so the initial change is $30 billion. If we're looking at the maximum change here, if our reserve requirement is 0.5, 1 over 0.5, then our money multiplier is going to be 2. Now one important thing to note here when we're doing this formula, so 2 million, this really should say negative 30 billion. Because if they're selling the bonds, that's going to take $30 billion out of circulation. So the total effect on the economy, $30 billion, the multiplier is 2, the money supply is going to go down by $60 billion. Right, so since the Fed is selling these bonds, it's going to shrink our economy. When they're buying these bonds, it's going to make our economy bigger. And we can do one more. If the maximum change is 100 billion, the reserve requirement is 0.1. If we're looking at this reserve requirement being 0.1, that means that they're not required to reserve very much. They can lend out a whole lot. So 1 divided by 0.1, our multiplier is going to be 10. So if the maximum change is 100, the multiplier is 10, then the initial change would need to be $10 billion. So the initial change is $10 billion, and that's going to have an effect on the economy, or the money supply, by 100 billion. Now I'm not going to go through the practice on the rest of these because it's the same math and we did it earlier in the review. But let's take a look at these cause and effect graphs next. So this is looking at how all of this monetary policy relates back to interest rates. So I think that looking at the right graph here would be the best place to start. Ladies, show what happens on each graph below when the central bank uses monetary policy to close the output gap. So here we're looking at this output gap. This long-run aggregate supply is the best that we can do. The strongest our economy can be at full employment. So right now we're underproducing. So we're going to need to use expansionary policies to close this gap. So in order to do that, what we would see here is that the Fed would use expansionary monetary policy to increase the money supply. When they do that, that drives down interest rates. So I'll call this IR2. All right, if interest rates are lower, the quantity of investment is going to go up, right? So again, with investment, we're looking at business investments. That at a lower interest rate, businesses are more likely to take out business loans. If that happens, it drives up the demand for goods because businesses are now, expanding, and part of aggregate demand is business investment. And so that would close up this gap then. So again, our money supply increases, which pushes down interest rates, which increases the demand for investments and demand for goods. Close the gap. Now here, we're having the opposite problem. We're in a positive output, and that's what this is asking us here. So the money supply goes up, interest rates go down, investment and consumer spending goes up, and aggregate demand would go up as well until we get to full employment. If we're looking at this next one, we're in a positive output gap. We're overproducing here. Inflation would be the issue. So we'd want to use contractionary policies to slow things down. So if we wanted to slow things down, the Fed would decrease the money supply. And these graphs are really important. They're always going to make you draw out one or two graphs on the FRQs. So we've got to get very comfortable with these graphs. So if the money supply decreases, interest rates go up. If interest rates go up, the quantity of investments goes down, which decreases our demand and puts us back at equilibrium, 82. So if the Fed is wanting to slow down our economy, they'd use contractionary policies that decrease the money supply. Money supply goes down, interest rates go up, investment in consumer loans goes down, aggregate demand goes down. All right, we've got a couple true or false questions here. An increase in the money supply will cause aggregate demand to decrease in the short run. So as we looked at a second ago, if we increase the money supply, interest rates go down, aggregate demand goes up. So that would be false. The federal funds rate is the interest rate that commercial banks charge each other. We struggle with this both on the quiz and the test. That is true. The federal funds rate is when banks borrow money from each other. The discount rate is when banks borrow from the Fed. And that discount rate they have a lot of control over. They set that interest rate. The federal funds rate isn't like one ironclad interest rate. It's kind of a window that they can charge, between 2 and 6% or 2 and 5%. Monetary policy can be implemented faster than discretionary fiscal policy. That's true, right? That for a stimulus bill to pass or like stimulus checks to go out, it's got to go through committee, it's got to go through the House, it's got to go through the Senate, it's got to be approved by the President, it's got to be implemented. There's all those lags with fiscal policy that you don't see in monetary policy. If the Federal Reserve wanted to raise interest rates tomorrow, they can. When commercial banks buy bonds from the central bank, the money supply increases. If we're looking at the commercial banks buying the bonds, no, because then they would have the bonds and the Fed would have the money. If we're looking at our money supply increasing, the Fed would be the one buying the bonds. So when the Fed sells these banks bonds, it slows down our economy, so that would be false. If the commercial banks are the ones buying the bonds, well, now they've got the bonds and not the cash, so they can't spend that. All right, and then for the second half of this, the most effective method of monetary policy depends on if the banking system has limited or ample reserves. Limited reserves means that they are lending out every dollar that they can, right? In which case, those tools of monetary policy are very effective. If they have ample reserves, it makes them a lot less effective. And that kind of gets at 38 right here. So let's say that right now, the bank has $1 billion worth of required reserves, and they've got $2 billion in their excess reserves. So they can lend out this money if they want, but they're choosing not to. So if the Fed buys back an extra $500,000 worth of bonds, now they just had more money than they had before. But they already had money to lend out, but they chose not to. So now they have more money that they're not lending out. So if the bank has ample reserves, it makes those tools of monetary policy a lot less effective. All right, draw the reserve market currently showing ample reserves. Label the equilibrium policy rate and equilibrium quantity Q1. So this is a pretty new graph that just got added into AP Macro maybe like a year or two ago. But what we're looking at here is the federal funds rate on the y-axis and the quantity of reserves on the x-axis. And so it's looking at banks when they have ample reserves pretty much. And the graph looks something like this. So on the top end, we've got the discount rate. And at the bottom end, we've got the interest on reserves. And this is kind of like that graph that I had up on the board. Right, I said that the discount rate is 6% and the interest on reserves is 2%. So if we're looking at the limited reserves, those tools of monetary policy work well, right? Let's say that we've got our money supply. If we decrease our money supply, that interest rate's going to go up. If we increase our money supply, interest rate goes down. But if we're looking at this bank having ample reserves here, then our money supply is going to be over here, right? Because in this case, if I increase or decrease my money supply, my interest rate, that federal funds rate, doesn't really change. It's going to stay about the same. So it's asking me to label that Q1 and the policy rate PR1. But essentially, with ample reserves, changing the money supply isn't really going to affect our interest rates because banks already have extra money that they can lend out if they want to. What would change things is raising or lowering this interest rate, but I think that's a little bit lower of a question. This interest on reserves, that's the money given to banks for storing money. Or we'll say for their excess reserves. So essentially the Fed started doing this back in 2008, and it kind of gives them another tool to deal with these ample reserves. Right now banks get about 2% interest for doing literally nothing, just for storing that money. So that means that they're not going to lend out money for anything less than that. Banks have an incentive to hold on to that money if they can. So if we're trying to get banks to lend out more, you might see the Federal Reserve lower down these interest on reserves. If they lowered it down to 0, well, now banks don't have any incentive to hold on to that money. They're more likely to lend it out to individuals. So if the interest on reserves is decreased, then the bottom part of the graph will just go lower, which should drive down interest rates. And how would the change on the graph affect aggregate demand in the short run? If interest rates are lower, aggregate demand goes up because businesses are going to invest more. Consumers are going to take out more loans. That would drive up the demand for goods. And then finally, this last part, the loanable funds market, different than the money market. We're looking at banks specifically now. The loanable funds market brings together the borrowers and lenders. Now lenders, we consider lenders and savers the same thing. If we're looking at banks, we're lending the bank our money when we give it to them. Right? We're saving our money in the bank, we're lending them that money, and then they pass it out to the borrowers and demand interest in return. So banks kind of bring together borrowers and lenders. We deposit money at banks, and we also borrow money from banks. Now, if we're looking at what can shift the supply and demand for loanable funds, and we could draw that out down here. Let's do that real quick. We're looking at the real interest rate, and we're looking at the quantity of loans. Now, unlike the money market where that supply of money is vertical because it's controlled by the Fed, our supply of loans is upward sloping. If interest rates go up, banks have more of an incentive of lending things out. We could call it 2%, 5%, 8% if we want. So at an 8% interest, they're more likely to supply that loan. At a 2% interest, they're less likely to supply it. Our demand for loans does the opposite. Right? We're more likely to take out this loan at a low interest rate, less likely to take it out at a high interest rate. And then we have our equilibrium rate, which is asking us to put R1 here. So if we're looking at anything that would shift our demand for loans, it's anything. Sorry, one second. It's anything that's going to change our borrowing habits. So anything that's going to change borrowing into that delta sign says change for borrowing for consumers, businesses, or the government. So if the government deficit spends, that increases their demand for loans. If we think that the economy is going to grow over the next couple of years, consumers and businesses will take out more loans. If we're looking at investment tax credits, so like if you open up a business, the government gives you a really big tax credit. If they expand that tax credit, people are more likely to take out those business loans. If they get rid of that tax credit, people are less likely to take out those business loans. So as far as things that would shift the supply of loanable funds, it's anything that would change savings. Consumer savings, business savings, government savings. All of those would affect how much money banks have to lend out. Another thing would be the capital inflow. That's when other countries are investing in ours. So if China right now has billions of US dollars, which they do, they can choose to buy US businesses with that money, which would mean that now that money is coming back into circulation and can be lent out. Explain why a loanable funds market involves real interest rates rather than nominal interest rates. It's because banks are going to account for inflation. So when a bank is looking at how much to charge for their loan, they're thinking about what they think inflation will be next year. If they think inflation is going to be 2%, then their loan is going to be higher than that 2%. So they're going to adjust for the inflation, in which case that would be our real interest rate. And this is just looking at some of the shifters. Will an increase in government borrowing cause the real interest rate to increase or decrease? If the government borrows more, their demand for loans goes up, which would push up interest rates. So interest rates would increase. Will a decrease in business investment, what would a decrease in business investment do to the real interest rate and quantity of loans? What's up? I could put it in her box at the end of the day for you.
This one's from
Miss who?
Miss Nix.
N-I-X?
Miss Nix.
Is that how you spell her name? N-I-X? Okay. I'll make sure she gets it. No problem. All right, so if there's a decrease in business investment, the demand for loans are going down, so the interest rate is going to go down. So interest rate's going to go down, and the quantity of loans are going to go down as well. What will an increase in private savings due to the interest rate and the quantity of physical capital? All right, so if more people are saving money, the supply of loans would increase. That's L2. Interest rates are going to drop. So interest rates are going to go down. And the quantity of physical capital. So that if interest rates are lower, businesses are more likely to invest. They're more likely to buy physical capital, new tools and machinery, AI, robotics, whatever. So the quantity of physical capital would increase. Don't worry about these last two. Those are lame. Doop, doop, doop. All right, I'll see you guys in Chapter 5, Unit 5.